Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Facts and Fallacies podcast. This is episode 217. I am your host, as always, Cameron English, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn, sitting in for Kevin Folta as he becomes a dad, which is always very exciting. Liza, how are you? Nice to see you again.
It's good to be here. Good to see you, Cameron.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, we've got some pretty intensive stories to cover today. So instead of our small talk and banter, let's just jump right into these because there's some stuff I definitely want to pick your brain about. So here we go. First up, AI medical assistants, ChatGPT answers patient questions with more empathy than human doctors. Next up, are endocrine disrupting chemicals causing a decline in fertility in men? Here's how ideology corrupts evidence-based science. And finally, cruelty-free lab-grown mini organs could dramatically reduce need for animal testing in drug development. So, like I said, these are intensive, very complicated stories, really important edges that we need to get to in these. But this first story, it's based on a really interesting study that was just published in JAMA Internal Medicine. And the article itself is by Danielle Ellis, writing for UC San Diego Today. So basically what these researchers did is they took 195 interactions between physicians and members of the general public from a Reddit subreddit called Ask Docs. So people submit their questions. They say, hey, how does my liver work? You know what I mean? Something like that. And then the physicians respond. So they took 195 of these. They gave the same question to this AI program that everyone's going on about, ChatGPT. They gave them the question and they asked the program to write an answer to the question. Then they took the AI's answer and the actual physician's answer from the Reddit subreddit, and they gave it to a panel of 3 physicians, and they said, rate these answers to these questions based on the quality of the information and the level of empathy expressed in the answer. And the headline grabbing result that they found was that 79% of responses from the program were preferred over the answers from actual doctors, right? So you can imagine this is radical, right? Everyone's going, oh no, is this AI thing a better doctor than my doctor kind of a thing? So there's lots of details, lots of nooks and crannies to explore here, but only one of us is a physician. So I'm very, very curious to get your input on this, Liza.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting study. And the reason why I think it's so interesting is because it actually is highlighting a big issue in medicine right now. And that is the limited amount of time that physicians have to spend with their patients. So initially, when AI programs started coming out and patients would get online and give a list of symptoms that they were having, the response would be a differential diagnosis of what this could be. So patients were, checking with Dr. Google to come up with a diagnosis. And Dr. Google was often very broad and often very wrong and often scared the living daylights out of their patients. Not only would they say, well, this could just be, a mild cold, but you could also have metastatic cancer. So patients would get very, very scared. And so I always had sort of big doubts about the benefit of AI and a computer in managing a patient's just in general. But this actually turns out to be really interesting because doctors' time is so limited now because of all of the requirements they have to fill out paperwork. We've become quite literally data entry clerks in our careers, right? So you have requirements to fill out paperwork for insurance companies. You have to get pre-authorization before you do a procedure. You have to get pre-authorization before you prescribe certain pharmaceuticals. And so you're filling out paperwork so much that your time is getting more and more limited. You also have to see a certain number of patients during the day, and you have to enter in all sorts of data about that patient encounter in order for you to get reimbursed for seeing that patient. And that is very onerous. In fact, there's a term in the medical world of pajama time, where physicians, after seeing patients, will go home and spend 2 to 3 hours documenting into just minute detail of what transpired in a patient encounter. Now, so that's kind of the setting. With electronic medical records, patients now also have patient portals where they can go and look up their lab results, and they can look up their X-ray results and their studies, and then directly contact the doctor. So now the doctor is also doing a lot of email responding to the patients on top of documenting everything. And sometimes the patients see scary diagnoses before the physician actually has time to see it. So, for example, I have a good friend who's an oncologist who's left her clinical practice because she would be getting so much email from patients that she couldn't actually do her clinical work because they were very justifiably scared. So now you layer on that, you're supposed to you've got somebody with a scary diagnosis who is needing some compassion and needing some interaction and more time from the doctor. And when the doctor is so busy with multiple patients with the same kind of problem, right? And each patient needs that extra empathy. It's very hard to keep up with all of the requirements of documentation and all the administrative responsibilities, and also have a moving, meaningful conversation with the patient. And this is one of the reasons, this I would say is probably the biggest reason for physician burnout at this stage, is that they feel like they're no longer able to interact with their patients. This ChatGPT thing, however, may be able to help offset some of that. So you could give a correct and empathetic answer without having to add so much more time. It may be a time saver.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny you mentioned, patients getting these confusing messages, because I remember recently I had to go to, because it was outside like normal business hours. I went to, what are they called? I went to the ER later, but I went to one of these urgent care. Yeah. So I went to one of these places. I saw one doctor, and then I went to the ER and saw another doctor. And then I followed up with my GP, and the two first doctors I saw, they both prescribed different medications. So I went to my doctor. I was like, what do I do here? Presumably I shouldn't take both of these at the same time, right? And she was like, go with the urgent care people. They know what they're doing. And I was like, okay, but like, it was still sort of concerning, because I'm like, why did you come to that decision?
Yes.
So maybe this is a situation, by the way, I'm obviously fine, right? I didn't die.
Yes.
But I could see a situation like that where you have a program, if it's properly developed, could go, oh, here's what they weren't telling you. Go with this, right? Right. Yeah. So anyways, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that you could have definitely sort of, this is, if you have a choice between these two drugs and this is the diagnosis, this is probably the better drug for that diagnosis.
Sure.
Now, there may be a reason that we don't know why a physician prescribes one drug over the other. There also in terms of safety, there's certain drugs that you don't want to mix together. Right. And so it'd be really important for, preventing adverse drug interactions and that kind of thing. So that kind of thing would be useful. I think it does need some oversight, because a lot of physicians use drugs off label for a variety of things. So for a medical toxicologist, we don't do double-blind controlled studies on poison patients, because it's unethical to poison patients to get your data, right? So the reason we prescribe lots of drugs that are off-label but work, right? And so an AI-generated machine might not understand why, for example, we would prescribe high dose insulin, really high dose insulin for patients who have a calcium channel blocker overdose. Because it wouldn't be the sort of classic thing that you'd find a whole bunch of studies, once again, randomized double-blind controlled pharmaceutical studies to support this, but it actually does have benefit. So I think that in those kinds of situations, it could be complicated.
Interesting. By the way, everyone, I know I'm blurry. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to get it fixed. My face might just be blurry, and you'll have to endure. I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, there we go. I think I fixed it. Okay. Anyways, back to AI medicine. Okay. So there's something else that really stuck out to me. And as we've said before on this show, there's the press release, there's the news story based on the press release, and then there's the nitty gritty of the study, which you'll often find in the discussion section, which I refer to as the come to Jesus section, because this is where all the true facts are that they don't want to promote. So here's one of those. And to their credit, it's in the paper, so they're not trying to hide it. But they write that the study's evaluators, the three physicians on this panel, despite being blinded to the source of a response and any initial results, they were also co-authors of the study, which could have biased their assessments of what they're looking at, right? Because they know that they're comparing an AI answer to a real doctor's. They may not know which one, but they're still privy to the design of the study, which could be a problem. Then they also say the additional length of the chatbot responses could have been erroneously associated with greater empathy. And this is the part that really stuck out to me, Liza. Evaluators do not assess the chatbot responses for accuracy or fabricated information. Now, especially in this age when everyone is flipping out about misinformation, this seems to be like a no duh, right? This should be a baseline of what you're checking for is whether the information's correct, right? And what am I missing there?
So no, that's exactly right. So you want to make sure that that this chat box has not got all sorts of input that's recommending alternative medicine therapies or things like that, and that's given the same weight as something that's really been studied well, right? So there's that issue, but there's also the issue that medicine changes, clinical medicine changes. So in the early 2000s, in ICU patients, there was a big study that suggested that ICU patients did better if they had their sugar under control, and very tight control, between 80 and 100 milligrams per deciliter, and that had a big mortality benefit in those patients. So in the ICUs, everybody was, doing that. And then 5-10 years later, another study came out and said, well, it doesn't really have that big of a mortality benefit, but it helps with protect the kidneys. So a morbidity benefit, but the mortality benefit seemed to go away over that decade. And then later on, they did another study repeating exactly the same protocol. And it turned out that maybe the mortality and the morbidity benefit weren't so great. And it was actually harming patients because their sugars were going too low. So when you've got an evolution in the clinical findings, and these are gold standard studies at top tier universities or academic institutions that are just sort of changing practice, how do you incorporate that into your AI? And so that's where protocol-based medicine doesn't quite always work as well. And you'd have to, stay on top of the literature, not only making sure that you've got the right literature going in, but as the literature evolves and as we learn, you're not using practices that actually could be harmful.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just a fascinating question. It just sounds like there's a lot of potential here, but if this is misused or it's not appropriately regulated, this could be really gnarly. And just one thing that occurs to me, and it seems realistic, is that you could have one of these programs programmed to give an answer that's accurate, but is also intended to cut costs, right? I could see Medicare implementing that, or an insurance company, especially insurance companies. I could see, right? And I'm sure you can share my frustration there, right? I could see them saying, well, there's two drugs. This one is, 12 cents cheaper per pill. Let's give this one, even though it might not be the ideal treatment for this patient. That could be a problem. I could see a lawyer having the same realization and going, I'm going to recruit 10,000 people to this class, and then we're going to sue the pants off of, Kaiser or Aetna or one of these big companies, and we're going to make a killing, whether or not it's a legitimate complaint, So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Yeah. You can program for cheap stuff, but sometimes people are put on specific pharmaceuticals because of their particular problem. Sometimes the medicine is better for their kidneys. Sometimes the medicine is better for their, blood pressure. And so the reason why you pick a certain medicine, even if it may be more expensive, may be because it's better for the patient, and you've already tried the patient on several other drugs that didn't work as well. So, so there's that. Then when you've got standard of care issues, right? Often standards of care, they're discussions about what is actual standard of care. And once again, that can be an evolution as people learn more about taking care of a certain disease process, right? Mm-hmm. But that's also an avenue for lawyers to be able to do class action suits or sue a hospital because they say, well, you didn't abide by this standard of care because of this guideline. But the AI machine, has said that that wasn't necessarily the standard of care based on an argument. Now, so for the longest time, for example, in spinal cord injury, you were kind of damned if you did and damned if you didn't. So if you gave steroids, there was some evidence that it improved outcomes, not much. And then if you didn't give steroids, there was some evidence that you had less risk of infection, right? And so lawyers were able to use the kind of the disagreement, the scientific disagreement about the quality of data around steroids to be able to take that kind of thing to court. And so you could technically probably do the same thing with this kind of thing.
Yeah. Lawyers and insurance companies making the world worse since, I don't know. This just occurs to me too, is that there may be situations where the problem isn't a response from a doctor, but it just could be like the policy is really screwed up, So, you could write into this program and go, I crushed both my knees in a car accident. Can I have more medicine for pain control? And like, what's the thing going to say? Like, no, sorry, the DEA might lock up your doctor if they give you medicine that's medically necessary. Have a nice life, right? So there's real policy issues, there's supply issues, there's expense issues, like $1,000 a month to insure your kid. Like, there's a lot of problems this is not going to fix. And not that they've implied that it will. I'm just saying, healthcare is really messy these days. So
it is very messy.
Okay. All right. Well, lots of stuff to think about. Go read the JAMA paper. It's actually open access and it's not too technical. So I think you'll get more out of it than just reading the news stories that have been floating around.
It's kind of a fun read for a medical journal.
Yeah. All things considered, there's not too many p-values and statistics and so forth. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to this next story. This one was interesting, but frustrating to read. So this is Dr. Jeffrey Cabot, who has been on the show before, as I mentioned last week. He's writing for a genetic literacy project. This is originally from June 2022, and it's called Are Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals Causing a Decline in Fertility in Men? Here's how ideology corrupts evidence-based medicine. Okay, so what he's talking about here is there's a pretty well-established consensus, I believe, that sperm counts are declining in the Western world, in America, in Canada, Australia, so forth, these types of places. Sperm counts are declining. There's pretty good research on that. And this is potentially serious, right? Because if you have declining sperm counts, you might have declining fertility, which means you have a declining population, which means there's nobody to build your house and grow your food, stock your grocery store shelves, produce the medicines, and so forth, right? Right. This could be really bad over time if we don't address it. So Cabot is responding here, though, to a team of researchers from MIT and Harvard, and they're led by a pair of philosophy professors. So these are not physicians, they're not fertility experts, they're not endocrinologists. These are people that seem to be working outside of their expertise to a certain extent. And they reject this hypothesis of declining sperm counts, excuse me. Lots of terms spinning around in my head. Now, they're not saying we have alternative data and we think there's a problem with this hypothesis. What they're saying, and this is a direct quote from an article they wrote for Slate, I believe. They say, far-right great replacement theorists who feared that people of color are replacing the white population have taken up the research with gusto. So in other words, their primary concern is not that this hypothesis is wrong, but they don't like the political implications of it. And we don't really have to talk about that here. It's not really relevant to what we're talking about, frankly. But that's their driver. Now, their alternative hypothesis is that sperm counts fluctuate throughout an individual's life. And this could be due to, different social or economic factors. It could be due to environmental influences and so forth. But the basic idea is there isn't like an appropriate sperm count, right? It goes up and down and it's okay. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, this and that. This is their argument. Cabot is having none of this, right? So, and he's really good at this in that for the most part, he seems to follow the evidence wherever it goes. And this gets him in trouble sometimes, which I really appreciate, that even if it has consequences for him, he goes, I don't care. This is what the evidence shows. So the authors are also very clear about their bias. This is not me adding to what they say. And this is actually another quote. This is from their website. So it's called the Gender Lab, which is where they do all this research. So they write, we're engaged in the intersectional study of gender in the biomedical and allied sciences, specializing in analyzing bias and hype in the sciences of sex, gender, reproduction, and intersectional study of race, gender, and science. Okay, so they're coming to this with a sort of postmodern, anti-colonialism sort of a perspective. This is not data-driven. I'll stop there and then give me your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting discussion too. First of all, I think there is a debate around whether or not there is a significant impact of decreased sperm production. There've been articles, spermageddon canceled, and a whole variety of different discussions around this topic. What we do know is that fertility has been decreasing in the West, right? And in developed countries, so Japan, US, the EU, people are having less babies. Now, a lot of people say, oh, that's because, you're well fed and there's availability of the pill, and people are older when they start having babies. So that decreases fertility and a whole variety of things that can go into it. Now, there are probably some things that are causing, changes in sperm count as well, that we aren't 100% clear on. What we do know, though, is that this debate is intensely political, right? and intensely polarized. And so people will often make claims in one direction or the other, depending on their political persuasions or their personal beliefs. So what you will find, like Greenpeace saying in a Spermageddon article from 2021, you're not half the man your father was. Oh, and Greenpeace is making the claim that, and same with the authors in this study that came out in Environmental Health Perspectives that was then repeated by Swan in 2017 in a reproduction journal. The claim is that, plastics and endocrine disruptors, synthetic endocrine disruptors like flame retardants and things like that might be causing the decrease in sperm count. We don't have solid evidence to say that that's the case, right? So those are all just sort of allegations. On the flip side, you can't just then say, well, no, that's not true. And this is, we just believe that this is, based on the patriarchy and concern about the West. You can't just say, throw away any scientific discussion and say that this is and shape it in a part of the culture war. You need to have a scientific basis for your claim, and I'm not seeing a scientific basis for their claim. I think that they say that they're not quite as worried. Fine, give us a scientific reason for why you're not quite as worried. So both sides. And what's interesting is I tend to think of the side that's very concerned about plastics and things like that as maybe also going to be in the same kind of wheelhouse as these latest authors. So I think that it's a kind of unique perspective, but once again, it's not based in science. Associations are not causation, and I think that both sides of this are being completely blown out of proportion.
Yeah. Let me try to fix my blurriness here. Let's see. Okay. I don't know. I don't care that much. Okay. All right. I'm back. Okay. So again, there's so much to say here. I have to say, and I've said this on this show, I've said it on Talking Biotech with Kevin on his other podcast. I've said it in writing. The social justice movement, whatever you think of it, the way that they have attacked the scientific enterprise drives me bananas, because their motivation is truth is determined by lived experience. Different people groups have their own truth. They have their own way of knowing. And that is, there's an 8-letter word. I'm not going to say it. All right. That's just nonsense. Yeah.
It's highly problematic.
Yes. Yeah. It's very problematic to say that you have your own truth You do not. And if you think that you can't listen to this podcast when we talk about science, okay, I'm sorry. All right. That's the first thing. It drives me absolutely bananas. Because on the one hand, they're trying to say, I'm rejecting your hypothesis, your empirical analysis of what's going on here. I reject that, but I reject it because I don't believe that there's such a thing as objective truth, or at least I don't believe that you can get at the objective truth because you're trying to, preserve your power with your rhetorics and your blah, blah. I have no time for this. I have real books and real things to learn. Go away.
Exactly. That said, I am willing to engage with people who have a completely different opinion than me. Yeah. If they are willing to have a discussion, because I want to know, I want to fact check myself. I want to make sure I have the latest and most up-to-date information. Because like I said in the earlier segment where we're talking about how things evolve, how science evolves, science is an iterative process. It's really important to be able to have scientific debate. But once it gets into ad hominem attacks, and once it gets into just pure speculation, that pure speculation and ad hominem attacks are not the same thing as a robust scientific discussion where you come to an understanding, a greater understanding about, the truth of something.
Yeah. And I should add, I wholeheartedly endorse that, but I should also add, Cabot gives them credit because they, in the process of developing this goofy, postmodernist theory of infertility, they reject the idea that there are these synthetic chemicals that are causing endocrine disruption. And they actually make some interesting observations. So one of the points that they make is that in India, where environmental pollution is significantly higher because they're a poorer country than, say, Canada or the United States, their fertility is higher than ours, which is interesting. So that would seem to indicate that it's not environmental pollutants, however you define those, that are causing the problem. There's got to be something else. So if they were to make those sorts of observations and say, let's investigate what those are, that would be great. And I think that would be enhancing the scientific conversation. But that's not what they're doing. They're trying to just say, I don't like where this is going, so let's stick our fingers in our ears. And that is very, very dangerous.
Exactly. And well, I mean, I have this thing about this notion that flame retardants are causing all sorts of problems. I would personally prefer not to have my children burn up in a fire. And I'd personally prefer, firefighters to be able to put out airplane fires. And there are, where this whole PFAS discussion is coming from, right? And that's why this other group is making all of these wild claims that are allegations with no clear evidence of a scientific interaction there that I think puts people at risk, public health at risk. I think there's something like 3,000 people die in fires every year. So if you can't put out fires adequately because of allegations in the literature that are also not validated, I get very concerned about that. So it goes both ways. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Very good point. And Cabot, he says at the top of the article, but it's a good summation. He says the lesson, ignoring evidence-based science in favor of preferred views, however well intended, can have devastating consequences. The examples you just gave are great. I don't want to be on an airplane where there aren't flame retardants. I don't want to be in a hospital that doesn't have an ample blood supply because they're not allowed to use plastic blood bags. You know what I mean? I don't want to use medicine that doesn't work. Like when my son has a fever, I want to give him ibuprofen to control his fever. I don't want this homeopathic bullshit.
Water.
I'll say it. I'm sorry. You know what I mean? Like I want things that are going to keep me healthy and that are going to make life better for more people.
Yes, we're living in a time with unprecedented abundance and luxury. Unprecedented. And people forget what it was like to live with roach infested, lice infested, unclean water and things like that. We've gotten so used to our quality of life that we're ready to jettison the things that actually have helped protect public health. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very important. So, and I guess because I started to rant there for a second, that is the takeaway, right? Is that there are real consequences. You may like to virtue signal, you may like to morally preen about how much more progressive you are, but if you put yourself in harm's way, It's not worth it to me. It's not worth it to me. So anyways, I highly recommend that article. It's very, very good. Cabot stuff usually is, because like I said, he's pretty much right up and down the middle in terms of calling balls and strikes. So, yeah. Okay. But let's move on to our last story here. This one, again, I think you're going to have a lot of insight here. So this is called Cruelty-Free Lab-Grown Mini Organs Could Dramatically Reduce Need for Animal Testing. This is by Nicole Axworthy at Veg News, which is my go-to source for all medical commentary, by the way. So there's a couple interesting things here. So first and foremost, just about every drug, every vaccine, every medicine you take, it's been tested on animals before it goes to clinical trials in humans. It's tested on rodents or maybe some other animal on occasion, depending on what the drug is or whatever. But this has raised a lot of animal welfare concerns over the years, particularly by websites like Veg News and from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which is an animal rights motivated group and so forth. So there's these concerns about taking care of animals, stop testing drugs on them and so forth. And so one of the solutions that's popped up, there's been multiple studies like this, but the idea is let's develop organoids, or let's develop some kind of a cell culture or a synthetic organ, something that replicates the system you're trying to study based on how it functions in the human body without, injecting a rat with an experimental cancer drug or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So this way you're protecting animals to a certain extent, and you're also testing drugs in a way to make sure that they are safe for human use and that they're effective. They're going to have their intended purpose. So you can fill in the technical details on what they did, but here's just a quick rundown. So this particular team of researchers, they isolated B cells from mouse spleens. They added what's called cellular signaling molecules and structural components, and then they encapsulated everything in a synthetic hydrogel matrix. I'm sure you all know exactly what that is. And then they took vaccine candidates targeting a condition called rabbit fever, and there's no approved vaccine for these. And then basically what they found is that this platform could be used to identify B cell clones that generate highly antigen-specific antibodies, which have a wide variety of potential applications. So in other words, this seems like it could be a viable way to develop new vaccines, which seems pretty cool. And then, of course, the wider implication is you could use this to test lots of different drugs, because this platform seems to better replicate, what the human body functions like. So lots to say here. Dr. Liza Dunn, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is early days. I think there's some very exciting science around this stuff. There are things called the organ on a chip, where you can try to sort of mimic an actual organ or an actual tissue when you are trying out a drug. So one of the things about drug studies is if you do it in vitro. So if you have a petri dish and you have cells on a petri dish and you pour the drug on the cells, you can get some information about what's going on intracellularly and how that cell's going to behave. But you also, though, don't get a complete picture, because when you take a drug, when you take a drug by mouth, let's just say, it goes through a whole complicated system before it gets absorbed. It goes through your GI tract, and your stomach's acidy, right? So you have to make sure that the drug gets through that acid matrix, and then your gut, it tends to be more alkaline, so more basic. And so where you're absorbing it, it matters when what the pH is matters. So just because you see something in a petri dish doesn't mean that you're getting the whole picture, because you've got multiple different cell types along your GI tract. And when you absorb it into the bloodstream, there are all sorts of processes it goes through before it gets to the bloodstream. So you can get some basic information. You can also get what we call cytotoxicity. So cytotoxicity is when you actually pour something on a cell and it kills the cells. Now, that might not be because the drug is actually going to kill the cells. It might be because, let's say that the drug is carried in a vehicle that interacts with cell membranes and damages the cell membranes and will kill it. So in vitro studies by themselves, just looking at naked cells, aren't always correct. They don't always give you a good idea of what's happening. So let me give you a really good example. You can say something is an endocrine disruptor. You might think is an endocrine disruptor if you have endocrine cells in a petri dish and you pour you pour a chemical on those endocrine cells and those cells die. Well, it may be because the substance you're pouring on it is in a soapy matrix, and the soapy matrix breaks up the cells and kills the cells. So you mistakenly think that the chemical is killing the cells because it's an endocrine disruptor, when it's actually just killing the cells because it's soap, because that's what soap does to cells. So to get around that, and that we normally do animal testing, right? So you have a system where you're feeding an animal something and it gets absorbed, and you get a much better idea of what percentage gets absorbed, where it gets absorbed, and things like that. And you get a whole system-wide effect. But a lot of people are like, oh no, this is a problem because you're doing animal studies and the animals die. And so we need to come up with a happy medium. So the happy medium at the moment is these novel alternative methods of testing, which is trying to manage animal testing, where they will do an organ on a chip. So you'll have a mini heart, or in this case with the vaccines, it's a lymph node, and that lymph node's generating antibodies, and then you can harvest those antibodies. That's potentially great technology for some drug development. For example, one of the ways we get antivenom for snake bites is by injecting horses or sheep with venom, and then they make the antibodies, and you harvest those antibodies, right? If you could actually just have a lymph node to do that, right, organ on a chip, you could actually make antivenom is extraordinarily expensive and very difficult to keep stable. So you could have large quantities of antivenom by using these lymph nodes to make antibodies to the venom. So there are all sorts of, there's great potential here. But once again, we've got to still tweak it, because just because you have one organ doesn't mean you have a whole system-wide thing. And there may be certain organs that are more productive than others. I think it's going to be very easy to say a lymph node is making antibodies, but it's going to be a little bit harder to say that when we give this particular drug and we have a little mini heart, we can see what it's doing to that heart, but you're then expecting that whole drug to get absorbed and stuff like that. So there's a lot more that needs to be worked out, but it's very interesting science at the moment.
Yeah, and let me give some real world examples of this. This is from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which is a pretty big name in the science world. Yeah. But they have a whole page dedicated to defending animal research, which I thought was interesting, because my initial take was, if this works, and it seems like it does, what the hell, right? But they point out several things here. So they point out that, for example, without animal testing, we would not have COVID vaccines, because they were all tested on rodents. I believe it was all rodents. They were all tested on animals in any case. And I would not have been comfortable giving it to my pregnant wife, or taking it myself without reasonably robust data, given how quickly they were developed. It just wouldn't have been possible without animal research. And along the same lines of what you're talking about with really complex systems, they point out that it's not possible to develop drugs for neurological and psychological conditions without actually testing those medicines on brains that are in living organisms like rodents. Because you have
a blood-brain barrier and all sorts of things, that layers that it's got to get through to operate, to work on the tissue of tissue that's targeted.
Right. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think this sort of brings up a divide in this conversation, because my concern, as always, is for humans, especially the little ones that I'm related to, right? I care about people. I care about my kids. I care about, you know what I mean? Care about poor kids on the other side of the world. If getting kids in Africa vaccines that could save their lives means injecting a few rodents, sorry, not a hard choice for me. Not a hard choice. Right. So one concern I have is that, and again, this is from a vegan news site, and it's not a terrible article, but it's painting this in a very, very favorable light. And they quote the PMRC, I think, PCRM. Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And they present themselves as we're this massive body of physicians. In reality, it's a handful of doctors and a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of animal rights activists. So, yes. And no disrespect, I don't really care what they think, because they have a very clear agenda, and it's not medicine, right? It's not making medicine better. That
said, this is really impacting the regulatory world. So there are big pushes to move away from animal testing. I don't know how realistic that is. But at the moment, they want to test and retest things that are actually already on the market. And we know what they do.
Right.
We know that and how they work and everything. And so having a vehicle for more regulation around a model that is not well developed costs taxpayers a whole lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we need to, that animals are, part of the safety testing that we do that's required by law, and it's for safety.
Yeah. Very good point. And again, I was critical just now, but this could be a benefit in that a lot of the studies that we have to rip apart on this show, they're cell culture studies or they're animal studies where they force feed a rat, 800 times the legally allowed dose of glyphosate. And they go, well, they got stomach cancer after we did that. It's like, well, yeah, obviously. So maybe in those cases, you could say, test it on this organ chip. And then if you get good data that way, maybe we have something to worry about here.
Exactly. Or, they'll inject in the stomach, they'll inject substances in the stomachs of animals. Yeah. That's not how we give, most of the time we give mouth, right? Or right. By IV. So they'll use routes that are of administration that are not realistic.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't know any farmers or pesticide applicators that stick a needle into their gut and inject glyphosate, right? So that's not
exactly.
Okay.
That's not the way to do it on the label.
Yes. Yeah. If you do that, the results are your fault. Sorry, no one's telling you to do that. But nonetheless, it's a good point, right? It sounds like maybe even if this isn't ready for prime time for drug development, it could have some uses. Yeah. Because in that case, I don't think animal rights are a thing. We can have that conversation some other day. But I also don't want to inject rats with insecticide or weed killer, right? Obviously, they were not supposed to get they're not supposed to get these chemicals, right? The weeds are, or the pests that eat your plants are, okay? Right. So there's some value in here. I'm necessarily cautious. I think pumping the brakes on this animal rights stuff, because I think that could get away from us is all.
Yes, I agree with you. And the safety is the most important thing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to call it a day with those 3 stories. We could keep talking about these for hours. And sometimes I would like to do that. I think my wife would get mad at me though, so I'm not going to do that. Okay. All right. But we'll be back next week for episode 218. Thank you for joining us as always. In the meantime, follow us on Twitter at Dr. Liza MD on Twitter, I believe. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Memory's still working. I am at Cam J English. We'd love to answer questions, talk about the show, argue with you if you're so inclined. That's fine too. Follow the Genetic Literacy Project. They are at Genetic Literacy. As I say every week, they put this whole thing on for us. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.